She collapsed in the snow, carrying a dying child through a blizzard that had already killed her husband's entire family. But the wolves circling behind them wouldn't wait for her to catch her breath. Welcome to a story about survival, sacrifice, and the quiet strength that breaks mountains. If you stay until the end, you'll discover how the woman everyone overlooked became the only reason anyone survived. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city name so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The saloon doors slammed open hard enough to crack ice off the hinges. Every head turned. Garrick Vale stood in the doorway like something carved from the mountain itself. 6'4" of muscle, scars, and silence. His coat hung heavy with snow. His boots left muddy tracks across floorboards that hadn't been clean in years. The room went quiet except for the crackling fire and the nervous shuffle of men pretending they weren't staring. Blackridge Hollow didn't scare easy. This was a town built by people who'd survived things that would have broken city folk in half. Winters here didn't just get cold, they got murderous. Men froze to death checking their own livestock. Women lost fingers to frostbite hanging laundry. Children disappeared into snowdrifts and weren't found until spring thaw. But even in a place this hard, Garrick Vale had a reputation. He lived alone up in the high country where the air got thin and the wolves got bold. His ranch sat 15 miles past where the road quit, wedged into a valley so remote that supply runs only happened twice a year. People said he'd killed 3 men in a land dispute down in Wyoming. Others claimed he'd survived a grizzly attack that should have ripped him apart. Nobody knew the full truth, and nobody asked. What everyone did know was this: Garrick Vale didn't come to town unless something had gone seriously wrong. He walked through the crowd without acknowledging anyone. Men shifted out of his path. A card game stopped mid-hand. Even Dutch Carver, who ran the saloon and feared exactly nobody, straightened up behind the bar. Garrick stopped in the center of the room. "I need a wife," he said. No preamble, no explanation, just 5 words dropped into the silence like stones into a well. Somebody laughed, nervous, uncertain. Garrick's eyes found the source, a drunk trapper named Bill Hutchins who'd been running his mouth since noon. "You need a what?" Bill said, grinning around tobacco-stained teeth. "Hell, Vale, you finally figure out you can't marry your horse?" A few men snickered, testing the waters. Garrick didn't blink. "I've got 2 orphaned children up at my ranch, boy and a girl. Found them 3 weeks ago after their folks died in a snowslide up near Timber Creek. They've got nobody. No family. No one coming for them." The laughter died. "Law says I can't keep them unless I'm married," Garrick continued. His voice stayed flat, factual. "Judge Hendricks gave me 30 days to find a wife, or the kids go to the orphanage in Ridgemont." Everyone in that room knew about the Ridgemont orphanage. It wasn't a place you sent children unless you wanted them destroyed. Kids went in scared and came out broken, if they came out at all. Disease ran through it every winter. The staff cared more about keeping order than keeping anyone alive. It was a warehouse for unwanted souls, and everyone knew it. "So you're here looking for charity." This from Marcus Webb, a cattle buyer who enjoyed other people's misery a little too much. "What woman in her right mind would marry you and go live in that frozen hellhole you call a ranch?" "I'm offering $200, Garrick said. "Cash, up front. The marriage is legal, but it doesn't have to be real. She keeps her own room, works the house, helps with the kids, that's all I'm asking." $200. The number hung in the air like smoke. That was more money than most people in Blackridge Hollow saw in 2 years. It was enough to buy passage to California. Enough to start over somewhere warm. Enough to change a life. "Any woman here can take it," Garrick added. "No questions asked." He looked around the room slowly, meeting eyes. Nobody moved. Oh, there were women in the saloon. There always were. Dance hall girls working the tables, a few wives sitting with their husbands, even Mary Holloway, the widow who ran the boarding house, nursing a whiskey in the corner. But none of them stood up. Because $200 wasn't worth freezing to death in the mountains. It wasn't worth living with a man everyone feared. It wasn't worth raising someone else's traumatized children in the kind of isolation that drove people insane. "Nobody?" Garrick's voice didn't change, but something flickered across his face. Not quite disappointment. More like confirmation of something he'd already known. "Maybe try the cat house," Bill Hutchins offered, and the men around him laughed. Garrick's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, this massive, scarred man who'd walked 15 miles through snow to ask for help, while the entire town silently refused him. "Guess those kids are heading to Ridgemont after all," Marcus Webb said, not even trying to hide his satisfaction. "Shame! But that's what happens when you live like a hermit and expect people to—" "I'll do it." The voice came from the back corner, quiet, almost too quiet to hear. Everyone turned. A young woman stood beside the kitchen door, wiping her hands on an apron that had seen better days. She was thin, not in the healthy way, but in the way that came from too much work and not enough food. Her dress hung loose on a frame that looked like it might snap in a strong wind. Mousy brown hair pulled back in a bun that was already coming undone. Gray eyes that didn't quite meet anyone's gaze. Lillian Cross. Most people in the saloon had to think for a second before they even remembered her name. She'd been working at the saloon for almost 2 years, washing dishes, hauling water, scrubbing floors, carrying trays when Dutch needed extra hands. She showed up before dawn and left after midnight. She never complained, never caused problems, never drew attention. In a town that respected loud voices and bold moves, Lillian was invisible. "You?" Marcus Webb looked at her like she'd just suggested flying to the moon. "Girl, you barely weigh 100 pounds soaking wet. You'd be dead inside a month up there." "I said, I'll do it," Lillian repeated. Her voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something that wasn't backing down. Bill Hutchins started laughing again. "Oh, this is perfect. Vale, you really want this scrawny little thing raising those kids? She can't even carry a full tray without shaking." "I carry trays just fine," Lillian said. In here, maybe. But up in those mountains?" Bill shook his head. "You'll freeze, or starve, or get eaten by something. Hell, the trip up there alone would probably kill you." "Then I guess that's my problem, isn't it?" The room went quiet again. Garrick was staring at her, really looking at her for probably the first time in his life, even though she'd served him drinks a dozen times over the years. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" he asked. Lillian nodded. "You need someone to help with the children. I can do that. It's not just the children. It's everything. Cooking, cleaning, mending, hauling water, chopping wood." "I know how to work," Lillian interrupted. "I've been doing it my whole life." "Not like this. Not in winter. Not in the mountains." "Then I'll learn." Garrick studied her for a long moment. Why? It was the question everyone wanted answered. Why would this girl, this quiet, overlooked girl, who had nothing and was nobody, volunteer to marry a stranger and disappear into the wilderness? Lillian's hands twisted in her apron. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because those children deserve better than Ridgemont, and because nobody else is going to help you." Something shifted in Garrick's expression. Not quite respect, not quite gratitude, but recognition maybe. Like he'd just realized they were both the kind of people the world had decided weren't worth noticing. "The money's yours regardless," he said. "Even if you change your mind later, even if it doesn't work out." "I won't change my mind." "You might. Most people do when they see what they've actually signed up for." "I'm not most people." Garrick almost smiled at that. Almost. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you are." Dutch Carver cleared his throat from behind the bar. "You two are serious about this? You're actually getting married?" "Tonight, if possible," Garrick said. "I need to get back to the ranch. The kids are alone." "You left them alone?" Mary Holloway spoke up from her corner, scandalized. "They're not babies. The boy's 15. But I don't like leaving them longer than I have to." "Tonight's not happening," Dutch said. "Reverend's 3 towns over, visiting his sister. Won't be back until Sunday." "Sunday, then." Garrick looked at Lillian. "That give you enough time to settle your affairs here?" Lillian almost laughed. Affairs, like she had property to divide or social commitments to cancel. "I just need to pack my things," she said. "Won't take long." "Sunday morning, then. Reverend Thompson marries us, and we leave for the ranch right after." He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and set it on the nearest table. It hit the wood with a heavy thunk that could only be coins. $200. Count it if you want." Lillian didn't move toward the money. "I trust you." "Don't." Garrick's voice was flat. "Don't trust anyone, not even me. Count it. Make sure it's real, and keep it somewhere safe until you decide what to do with it." Then he turned and walked out of the saloon without another word. The door slammed behind him, and the entire room erupted. "Girl, are you out of your damn mind?" Dutch came around the bar, looking at her like she'd just drunk poison. "You have any idea what you just agreed to?" "I know exactly what I agreed to." "No, you don't. You've never even been up in those mountains. You've never spent a winter where the temperature drops so low your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. You've never gone weeks without seeing another human being. I've never had a choice before," Lillian said quietly. "Now I do." Mary Holloway stood up and crossed the room. She was a hard woman, had to be after her husband died and left her with nothing but debts. But there was something almost gentle in her voice when she spoke. "Honey, listen to me. I know things are hard here. I know Dutch doesn't pay you enough, and I know you sleep in that awful little room above the kitchen, and I know you probably feel like you're drowning every single day. But this isn't the answer." "Then what is?" Lillian met her eyes. "Working here until I'm too old to carry trays? Hoping some man in town decides I'm worth marrying even though I've got nothing to offer? Ending up like—" She stopped herself. "Ending up like me?" Mary finished. "Go ahead and say it. Ending up alone and bitter and barely scraping by?" "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did, and you're right." Mary's expression hardened. "But at least I'm alive. At least I didn't get myself killed chasing some desperate fantasy about playing house with a man who lives like an animal." "He's not an animal. He's just dangerous," Mary interrupted. "He's dangerous, Lillian. Everyone knows it. Why do you think he lives alone up there? Why do you think no woman in this room stood up when he offered that money?" "Because they're scared. Because they're smart." Lillian looked down at the leather pouch on the table. $200. More money than she'd ever seen in one place. But that wasn't really why she'd said yes. She'd said yes because when Garrick Vale walked into that saloon and asked for help, she saw something in him that everyone else missed. She saw the same thing she saw every morning when she looked in the mirror. Desperation. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that made you scream or cry or throw things. The quiet kind. The kind that settled into your bones and whispered that this was all there was, all there would ever be unless you did something drastic. And maybe that was stupid. Maybe it would get her killed. But staying here, invisible, exhausted, forgotten, that was killing her anyway, just slower. "I'm doing this," Lillian said. Mary stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Then you're a damn fool, but you're a damn fool who's going to need warmer clothes than what you've got." She pulled a key from her pocket. "Come to the boarding house tomorrow. I've got some things that might fit you. Won't be pretty, but they'll keep you from freezing to death your first week." Lillian's throat tightened. "I can't pay you." "I'm not asking you to. Consider it a wedding present, or a funeral expense, depending on how this goes." Dutch was shaking his head. "I can't talk you out of this?" "No." "Then I hope you know what you're doing, girl. Because once you're up in those mountains with him, there's no easy way back." Lillian picked up the leather pouch. It was heavier than she expected. "I know," she said quietly. The next 3 days passed in a blur. Lillian worked her regular shifts at the saloon, but everything felt different now. People who'd never spoken to her suddenly had opinions. The dance hall girls thought she was crazy. The wives thought she was desperate. The men made jokes she tried not to hear. Only a few people helped. Mary Holloway gave her 2 wool dresses, a heavy coat that had belonged to her late husband, and a pair of boots that were too big but could be stuffed with newspaper. She also gave her advice that Lillian didn't ask for but probably needed. "Don't try to change him," Mary said while packing everything into a canvas bag. "Men like that, men who've lived alone that long, they don't change. Best you can do is find a way to exist alongside him without losing yourself in the process. I'm not trying to change anyone. I'm just trying to help those children. The children aren't your responsibility. They are now." Mary looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been respect. Lillian couldn't tell. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most foolish," Mary said. "Time will tell which." Sarah Chen, one of the older dance hall girls, slipped her a small jar of salve. "For your hands," she said quietly. "Trust me, you're going to need it. The cold up there will split your skin open if you're not careful." Even Dutch, gruff, cynical Dutch, who'd barely paid her a living wage, gave her a bag of coffee beans and a tin of tobacco. "For Garrick," he explained. "Man lives on coffee and spite. This'll buy you some goodwill, at least at first. Thank you, Lillian said, surprised. Dutch shrugged. You're a good worker. Hate to lose you, but if you're determined to do this damn fool thing, might as well not go empty-handed. The hardest part was the waiting. 3 days felt like 3 years. Lillian couldn't sleep. She barely ate. Her mind kept spinning through everything that could go wrong and nothing that could go right. What if the children hated her? What if she couldn't handle the work? What if Garrick turned out to be cruel behind closed doors? What if she froze to death before spring? What if? But every time the fear got too loud, she thought about those 2 orphaned children alone in a cabin in the mountains. She thought about what would happen to them if nobody helped. And she thought about the look on Garrick's face when he'd stood in that saloon asking for something he already knew he wouldn't get. Sunday morning came cold and gray. Lillian dressed in one of Mary's wool dresses, dark blue, practical, warm. She braided her hair and pinned it tight. She packed everything she owned into the canvas bag Mary had given her. It wasn't much. A few dresses, some underclothes, a hairbrush, a small Bible her mother had given her years ago before the fever took her. That was it. 26 years of life packed into one bag. She walked to the church alone. It was a small building at the edge of town, more functional than beautiful, the kind of place that had seen more funerals than weddings. When Lillian pushed open the door, she found Garrick already inside, standing near the front with his hat in his hands. He'd cleaned up, shaved, changed into what was probably his only good shirt. But he still looked uncomfortable, like a wild animal someone had tried to dress in human clothes. Reverend Thompson stood behind the pulpit, looking uncertain. He was a thin man in his 60s who'd probably married hundreds of couples over the years, but this was clearly the strangest wedding he'd ever performed. "Miss Cross," he said when Lillian approached, "I feel obligated to ask one more time. Are you certain about this?" "I'm certain. Marriage is a sacred covenant, even if the circumstances are unusual. It's not something to enter into lightly." "I'm not entering into it lightly, Reverend. I'm entering into it with my eyes open." "Very well." He opened his Bible with hands that shook slightly. "Let's begin." There were no guests, no flowers, no music, just 3 people standing in an empty church while wind rattled the windows. The ceremony lasted maybe 5 minutes. Reverend Thompson read the traditional vows, but his voice carried doubt with every word. Garrick's responses were quiet and measured. Lillian's were quieter still. "Do you, Garrick Vale, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Lillian Cross, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife." He didn't say, "You may kiss the bride," probably because everyone in the room knew this wasn't that kind of wedding. Garrick signed the marriage certificate with rough, unpracticed handwriting. Lillian signed beneath him, her hand steadier than she expected. And just like that, she was married. Mrs. Garrick Vale, a wife to a stranger, a stepmother to children she'd never met. "I've got the wagon outside, Vas," Garrick said. "We should leave soon. Weather's turning." Lillian nodded. She picked up her bag and followed him out of the church without looking back. The wagon was old but solid, built for hauling supplies through rough terrain, not for comfort. 2 horses stood hitched to the front, their breath steaming in the cold air. The wagon bed was loaded with supplies: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, blankets, tools. Garrick took Lillian's bag and secured it with the rest of the cargo. Then he offered her his hand to help her climb up onto the seat. His hand was calloused, scarred, and surprisingly warm. "It's a long ride," he said once she was settled. 6, maybe 7 hours depending on the snow. "There's a blanket behind the seat if you need it." "I'll be fine." "Take it anyway." He pulled the blanket out and draped it across her lap before climbing up beside her. Then he snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward. Black Ridge Hollow disappeared behind them within minutes. They rode in silence for the first hour. The road, if you could call it that, was barely more than frozen ruts cutting through dense forest. Snow hung heavy on the pine branches. Ice glittered on rocks. The temperature dropped with every mile. Lillian had never been this far from town. Never been anywhere, really. Her whole life had existed within a 5-block radius. Now she was heading into true wilderness with a man she didn't know. "You should eat something," Garrick said eventually. He pulled a cloth-wrapped package from his coat and handed it to her. Inside was dried meat and hard cheese. "I'm not hungry." "Eat anyway. You're going to need your strength." Lillian took a small piece of meat and chewed slowly. It was tough and salty, but not terrible. "Those children," she said quietly. "What are their names?" "Caleb and Nora. He's 15. She's 7. "And their parents died in a snowslide?" 3 weeks ago. I was checking my trap lines and heard someone calling for help. Found the kids huddled in what was left of their wagon. Parents were already gone, buried under 10 feet of snow." "That's horrible." "It's the mountains. Things die up here. Animals, people. Doesn't matter." His voice was flat, but Lillian caught something underneath it. Not quite sadness, more like resignation. Are they doing okay?" she asked. Garrick was quiet for a long moment. "No, but they're alive. That's what matters right now." The silence settled back over them. Lillian watched the landscape change as they climbed higher. The forest grew thicker, the snow grew deeper, the air grew colder. She pulled the blanket tighter and tried not to think about how far they were from anything resembling civilization. "Can I ask you something?" Her voice sounded small against the emptiness. "Go ahead." "Back in the saloon when I stood up, you didn't seem surprised. Why?" Garrick glanced at her. "Because desperate people recognize each other." It wasn't cruel, just honest. "And you think I'm desperate?" "I know you are. Same as me." Lillian wanted to argue, but she couldn't, because he was right. "Can I ask you something now?" Garrick said. "Okay." "That question you asked me in the saloon about whether I'd be kind." He kept his eyes on the road. "Why did you ask that?" Lillian thought about it. About all the men she'd known in her life. Her father, who'd disappeared when she was 12. The men at the saloon who looked through her like she was furniture. The ones who looked at her in ways that made her skin crawl. "Because kind is rare," she said finally, "and I wanted to know if you were going to make my life harder than it needed to be." "And you believed me when I said I'd try?" "I did." "Why?" "Because you didn't promise. You didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. You told me the truth." Garrick made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Most people don't want the truth. They want pretty lies. I'm not most people." "No," he said quietly. "You're not." They rode in silence for another hour. The road got worse. The wagon lurched and bounced over frozen ground. Lillian's teeth rattled. Her hands went numb even through her gloves. Just when she thought she couldn't take another minute, Garrick pulled the wagon to a stop. "We'll rest the horses here," he said. "There's a creek just through those trees. Water's still running." He climbed down and offered her his hand again. Lillian took it, grateful because her legs had gone stiff from sitting. While Garrick tended the horses, Lillian walked to the creek. It was narrow but fast-moving, cutting through ice and rock. She knelt down and splashed freezing water on her face, trying to wake herself up. That's when she saw the blood. Not much. Just a few drops on the snow near the creek bank, fresh enough that it hadn't frozen yet. "Garrick?" Her voice came out sharper than intended. He was beside her in seconds, rifle already in his hands. "What is it?" She pointed at the blood. Garrick knelt down, studying the tracks she hadn't even noticed. His jaw tightened. "Wolfpack came through here recently, maybe an hour ago." Is that normal?" "This time of year? Yeah. They're hungry. Game's scarce in deep winter, so they come down lower looking for food." "Are we safe?" "As long as we keep moving." He stood up, scanning the tree line. "They usually don't bother people. Usually." That last word hung in the air like a threat. They got back on the wagon and kept going. Lillian tried not to think about wolves following them through the trees, tried not to imagine yellow eyes watching from the shadows, tried to focus on anything else. But every snapping branch made her flinch, every distant sound made her heart race, and Garrick kept the rifle across his lap the entire time. The sun was setting by the time they finally reached the ranch. Lillian had been expecting something small. A cabin, maybe. Rough, but functional. What she saw instead made her stomach drop. The ranch was barely standing, a single-room structure with walls that looked like they'd been patched 100 times and would need patching 100 more. The roof sagged in the middle. One window was covered with oiled paper instead of glass. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, which meant someone had kept the fire going at least. Behind the cabin was a lean-to that probably served as a barn, though it looked ready to collapse under the weight of snow on its roof. A few scraggly chickens scratched at the frozen ground. That was it. No other buildings, no neighbors, nothing but wilderness stretching in every direction. This was where she was going to live. This was her home now. The door opened before they reached it. A boy stepped out onto the porch, tall and gangly, with dark hair and darker eyes. Caleb. He looked at Lillian with an expression that wasn't quite hostile, but definitely wasn't welcoming either. "You actually went through with it," he said to Garrick. "I did." "And this is her?" Caleb's eyes swept over Lillian dismissively. "This is who's supposed to take care of us?" "This is Lillian," Garrick said. His voice carried a warning. "My wife, and you'll treat her with respect." Caleb made a sound that might have been agreement, but probably wasn't. A smaller figure appeared in the doorway behind him, a little girl with tangled blonde hair and a face too serious for 7 years old. She stared at Lillian without speaking. "Nora," Garrick said gently. "Come say hello." The girl didn't move. Lillian climbed down from the wagon on legs that barely worked. She was exhausted, frozen, and terrified, but she forced herself to smile anyway. "Hello," she said softly. "It's nice to meet you both." Neither child responded. Garrick started unloading the wagon. "Caleb, help me with these supplies. Nora, show Lillian where things are inside." The little girl finally moved, backing into the cabin without taking her eyes off Lillian. Lillian followed her inside and immediately understood why the children looked so wary. The cabin was freezing despite the fire. Wind whistled through gaps in the walls. The floor was dirt-packed hard as stone. There was a table, a few chairs, a cook stove that had seen better days, and sleeping areas divided by hanging blankets. Supplies were stacked haphazardly in corners. Everything was functional at best. This wasn't poverty. This was survival. "That's where you'll sleep." Nora pointed to a corner behind one of the blankets. "Garrick says you get your own space." "Thank you," Lillian said. She set down her bag and looked around, trying to figure out where to even start. There were dirty dishes piled near the wash basin, clothes that needed mending, floors that needed sweeping, 1,000 small tasks that added up to overwhelming. Outside, she could hear Garrick and Caleb talking in low voices. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. Caleb didn't trust her, didn't want her here. Fair enough. She didn't exactly trust herself either. The door opened and Garrick came in carrying the last of the supplies. "I'll show you around properly tomorrow," he said. "But the basics? Water comes from the creek, about 50 yards north. Outhouse is behind the cabin. Firewood stacked on the east side, but we'll need more before the week's out. Chickens need feeding twice a day. Caleb and I handle the heavy work, but you'll need to manage the house, the cooking, and the kids when I'm out." Lillian nodded, trying to memorize everything. "Questions?" Garrick asked. "About 1,000. But she settled on one. "When do I start?" Something flickered across Garrick's face. Approval, maybe. "Now," he said. "Welcome home." The first night, Lillian didn't sleep at all. She lay in the darkness behind the hanging blanket that served as her bedroom wall, listening to the cabin groan under wind that never stopped. Every few minutes, a new sound would jerk her awake. The crack of settling timber, the skitter of something moving across the roof, the distant howl that might have been wind or might have been wolves. The fire had died down to embers hours ago. She could see her breath in the air. 3 blankets weren't enough. 4 wouldn't have been either. The cold crept through every gap in the walls, through the floorboards, through the thin mattress stuffed with straw that separated her from frozen ground. She thought about the small room above the saloon kitchen, how she'd complained about the heat in summer, the noise at night, the smell of grease that never quite left her hair. She'd have given anything to be there now. When gray light finally started seeping through the gaps in the walls, Lillian forced herself to get up. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were stiff and clumsy as she dressed in the darkness, layering every piece of clothing she owned. The main room was barely warmer. Garrick was already awake, crouched by the stove coaxing the fire back to life. He glanced up when she emerged. "Coffee's almost ready," he said. "I can make it." "Already done." He poured thick black liquid into 2 tin cups and handed her one. Lillian wrapped both hands around it, grateful for the warmth, even if the coffee tasted like burnt dirt. "Sleep okay?" Garrick asked. "Fine," Lillian lied. He didn't call her on it, but the look in his eyes said he knew better. "You'll adjust," he said. "Takes a few weeks, but your body figures it out." "What needs doing today?" Garrick stood up, rolling his shoulders. "I've got to check the trap lines. Caleb's coming with me. We'll be gone most of the day." Lillian's stomach tightened. "You're leaving?" "The traps don't check themselves. We lose too many days and animals start rotting in the snow. Can't afford to waste the pelts." "What about—" She glanced toward where the children slept. "Nora stays with you. She'll show you the routine, feeding chickens, hauling water, basic cooking. Nothing complicated. Nothing complicated." Right. Lillian had never fed a chicken in her life, had never hauled water farther than across a kitchen, had never cooked anything more elaborate than stew over a saloon stove. "I'll manage," she said. "I know." Garrick drained his coffee. "There's dried venison and beans in the store barrel, flour and salt on the shelf. Don't use too much of anything. We need supplies to last until spring." "How long is that?" 3 months? Maybe 4 if winter runs long. 3 months. Lillian tried not to think about that. Garrick pulled on his heavy coat and grabbed his rifle. "Keep the fire going. Keep the door barred when I'm gone. And if you hear anything unusual, anything at all, get the shotgun from above the door and keep it close." "What kind of unusual?" "You'll know it when you hear it." That wasn't reassuring. Caleb emerged from behind his blanket wall, already dressed for the cold. He moved past Lillian without acknowledgement, grabbed his own coat, and followed Garrick toward the door. "Caleb," Garrick said quietly. The boy stopped. "She's trying. Least you can do is not make it harder." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Then they were gone, and Lillian was alone with a 7-year-old girl who still hadn't spoken a single word to her. Nora sat at the table, watching Lillian with those too serious eyes. Her hair was a mess of tangles. Her dress was stained and too small. She looked like she hadn't been properly cared for in weeks, which Lillian realized she probably hadn't been. "Good morning," Lillian said gently. Nora didn't respond. "Your uncle said you'd show me where things are. The chickens need feeding?" Still nothing. Lillian tried a different approach. "I've never fed chickens before. I don't really know what I'm doing. Could you help me?" Finally, Nora stood up. She walked to a barrel in the corner, scooped grain into a small bucket, and headed for the door without checking if Lillian was following. Outside, the world was blindingly white. Snow covered everything: the lean-to, the woodpile, the chicken coop that looked like it might collapse if someone breathed on it too hard. The sky was the color of old pewter. The air hurt to breathe. Nora trudged through snow that came up to her knees, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Lillian struggled to keep up, her 2 big boots slipping on ice hidden beneath the powder. The chicken coop was basically a wooden box with a door. Nora opened it and scattered grain on the ground inside. 6 scrawny chickens rushed over, pecking frantically. "Twice a day," Nora said, her first words. "Morning and evening. Don't give them too much or Uncle Garrick gets mad." "Okay," Lillian said. "Thank you for showing me." Nora shrugged and headed back toward the cabin. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of tasks Lillian barely understood. Nora showed her where the water bucket lived, then led her down a narrow path to the creek. Breaking through the ice took longer than Lillian expected, and hauling a full bucket back uphill left her gasping for breath. "You're weak," Nora observed. "Not cruel, just factual." "I'm working on it," Lillian managed between breaths. By noon, Lillian had hauled 3 more buckets of water, fed the fire 4 times, and attempted to cook beans that turned out half burnt and half raw. Her hands were cracked and bleeding despite the salve Sarah had given her. Her back screamed with every movement. She'd never been this tired in her life. And it was only the first day. Nora picked at the burnt beans without complaining, which somehow made Lillian feel worse than if she'd thrown them on the floor. "I'll do better tomorrow," Lillian said. "Mama used to soak them overnight," Nora said quietly. "Makes them softer." It was the first time she'd mentioned her mother. "That's smart," Lillian said. "I'll try that tonight." They ate in silence. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled and popped. Lillian's entire body hurt. Why'd you marry him? Nora asked suddenly. Lillian looked up, surprised. Your uncle. You don't love him, I can tell. There was no point lying to a child who'd already lost everything. You're right. I don't. Not yet, anyway. Then why? Lillian thought about how to answer that. Because he needed help, and because I thought maybe you and Caleb needed someone too. We don't need you, Nora said, but her voice wavered. Maybe not, but I'm here anyway. Nora stared at her for a long moment, then went back to picking at her beans. That afternoon, Lillian tried to tackle the disaster that was the cabin. There was dirt everywhere, dishes piled high, clothes that needed washing, tears and blankets that needed mending. She didn't know where to start, so she just started. She scrubbed dishes with freezing water and lye soap that stripped the skin from her hands. She swept the floor with a broom that was more stick than bristles. She tried to organize supplies that had been shoved into corners with no system whatsoever. Every task took 3 times longer than it should have because she didn't know where anything was, didn't know how anything worked, didn't know what she was doing. Nora watched from the corner, sometimes helping, sometimes just staring. You're doing it wrong, she'd say occasionally. And Lillian would have to swallow her pride and ask, how should I do it? By the time Garrick and Caleb returned just after sunset, Lillian was ready to collapse. Her hands were raw, her back was on fire, her feet were numb from standing on the frozen floor all day. But the cabin was cleaner than it had been that morning. There was hot water ready for washing, fresh coffee brewing, and beans soaking for tomorrow. Garrick took in the changes without comment, but something in his expression shifted. You've been busy, he said, just trying to be useful. You are. He set down his rifle and started removing his coat. We got 4 rabbits and a fox. Good day. Caleb brushed past Lillian on his way to his corner, still refusing to acknowledge her existence. That became the pattern. Days blurred together in an exhausting cycle of hauling water, chopping wood, cooking meals, mending clothes, cleaning, and trying desperately to keep up with tasks that never ended. Lillian woke before dawn and collapsed after midnight. Her hands bled. Her muscles screamed. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. But slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, things started to shift. The beans stopped burning. Her bread started rising properly. She figured out how to keep the fire at the right temperature for cooking. She learned which boards in the floor were loose, which spots in the roof leaked when snow melted, which chicken was mean and would peck if you weren't careful. Nora started sitting closer during meals, started asking questions instead of just watching, started showing Lillian things without being asked, where Garrick kept the extra rifle ammunition, how to tell when the bread dough had risen enough, which herbs growing near the creek were safe to eat. Mama taught me, Nora would say. And Lillian learned that if she stayed quiet and didn't push, Nora would keep talking. About her mother, who'd made the best venison stew. About her father, who taught her to identify animal tracks in the snow. About the life they'd had before the snowslide buried everything. Caleb was harder. He barely spoke to Lillian. When he did, it was in short, clipped sentences that made it clear he was only communicating out of necessity. He wouldn't eat until she left the table, wouldn't accept help with anything, acted like she was invisible most of the time. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, Lillian found him sitting on a stump behind the cabin, staring at nothing. You okay? She asked. Fine. Doesn't look fine. What do you care? His voice was sharp. You're just here for the money. Everyone knows it. That stung, but Lillian didn't back down. I'm here because 2 kids needed someone and nobody else was willing. The money's just money. Right. That's why you're still here. Not because you're stuck in the middle of nowhere with a man you don't know and a winter that'll probably kill you. Maybe I am stuck, Lillian said. But so are you. So either we can make this harder on each other, or we can try to get through it together. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her. You don't get it. You don't get what it's like. You're right, I don't. I've never lost my parents, never watched everything I knew get buried in the snow. But I do know what it's like to be alone, to feel like nobody sees you, to wake up every day wondering if this is all there is. His jaw worked. That's not the same. No, it's not. Your pain is worse, I know that, but it's still pain. For a moment she thought he might actually talk to her, might let something crack open. Instead, he stood up and walked away. But the next morning, he nodded at her when she poured his coffee. It was something. Garrick remained a mystery. He was gone most days, checking traps, hunting, hauling firewood, doing the 100 impossible tasks required to keep them alive. When he was home, he was quiet. Not cold, exactly. Just distant. Like he'd learned a long time ago not to let anyone too close. But Lillian noticed things. How he always made sure she had the warmest spot by the fire at night. How he'd leave extra wood stacked by the stove so she wouldn't have to haul it herself. How he'd come back from the creek with fresh water without being asked, knowing she was already exhausted from the day's work. Small things. Wordless things. One night, after Caleb and Nora had gone to bed, Lillian was trying to mend a tear in one of Garrick's shirts. Her fingers were clumsy with cold and exhaustion, and she kept dropping the needle. "You don't have to do that," Garrick said from his spot by the fire. "Yes, I do. That's why I'm here." "You're here because I asked you to help with the kids. Everything else is just..." "Oh, just what? Extra?" Lillian looked up. "This is my job, Garrick. You're paying me to take care of this household. That includes you. I've been taking care of myself for a long time." "Well, now you don't have to." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd quit after the first week. Maybe sooner." "Still time for that," Lillian said wryly. "No, I don't think there is." He stood up, rolling his shoulders. "You're tougher than you look." "I'm not tough at all. I'm just too stubborn to quit." "Same thing, out here." He disappeared behind his blanket wall, leaving Lillian alone with her mending and a strange warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The fourth week, winter showed them what it was really capable of. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the bucket overnight. Snow fell for 3 days straight, burying the cabin up to the windows. Wind howled like something alive and angry, shaking the walls so hard Lillian thought they might collapse. They were trapped inside. All 4 of them, in a space barely big enough for 2, with nothing to do but wait out the storm and try not to drive each other crazy. Caleb paced like a caged animal. Nora got quieter than usual. Garrick sat by the fire, methodically sharpening every blade they owned, and Lillian tried to keep everyone fed on dwindling supplies while pretending she wasn't terrified. On the second day, they ran out of bread. Lillian had been rationing the flour, but there just wasn't enough. She made thin soup from beans and the last of the dried venison, stretching it as far as it would go. Nobody complained, but she saw the way Garrick looked at the children's bowls, saw the way he ate less so there'd be more for them. That night, after Caleb and Nora were asleep, Lillian confronted him. "You need to eat," she said quietly. "I'm fine." "You're not. You're giving your portions to the kids. They're growing. They need it more. And you need to stay strong enough to keep us all alive. Don't be stupid about this." Garrick's eyes narrowed. "Careful." "Or what? You'll kick me out into the blizzard?" Lillian crossed her arms. "Listen to me. If you collapse because you're starving yourself, we all die. So stop being a martyr and eat your damn food." For a second, she thought she'd pushed too far, thought he might actually get angry. Instead, he laughed. Actually laughed. A short, rough sound that she'd never heard from him before. "You've got a mouth on you when you're scared," he said. "I'm always scared. You just don't notice." "I notice." His voice went quiet. "I notice everything about you." The air between them shifted. Lillian's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Garrick!" "I should check the horses." He stood up abruptly and grabbed his coat. "It's the middle of the night, in a blizzard. They need checking." He left before she could argue, disappearing into the storm. He was gone for over an hour, and when he came back, his face was red from cold and his eyes carefully avoided hers. On the third day, the storm broke. Garrick and Caleb dug out the door and spent the afternoon clearing paths to the chicken coop, the lean-to, and the creek. Lillian and Nora inventoried their remaining supplies. It wasn't good. Flour? Enough for maybe 2 more weeks if they stretched it. Beans? 3 weeks, same conditions. Dried meat? Less than a week. Salt, coffee, sugar, running low on all of it. "We're going to run out," Lillian said. Garrick nodded. He'd been expecting this. "I'll need to go to town, restock before the next storm hits." "How long will you be gone?" 3 days? Maybe 4 if the weather turns." 3 days. alone with the children in the wilderness. Lillian's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "We'll be fine." "I know you will." He paused. "But I'm still going to show you how to use the rifle, just in case." That afternoon, while Caleb watched the cabin and Nora fed the chickens, Garrick took Lillian into the clearing behind the lean-to. The rifle was heavier than she expected, cold metal that made her hands ache. "Don't overthink it," Garrick said, standing behind her. "Stock against your shoulder, sight down the barrel. Breathe out and squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it." Lillian tried. The recoil knocked her back into Garrick's chest, and the shot went wide, hitting a tree trunk 15 feet from the target he'd set up. "Again," he said. They practiced until her shoulder was bruised and her ears were ringing. By the end, she could hit the target more often than not. "You're not going to win any competitions," Garrick said, "but you can defend yourself if you need to. That's what matters." "I hope I don't need to." "Me too." He left before dawn the next morning. Lillian stood in the doorway and watched him ride away on one of the horses, supplies packed behind him, rifle across his lap. The cabin felt emptier without him. Caleb felt it too. He was quieter than usual, more withdrawn. At dinner that night, he barely touched his food. "He'll be back," Lillian said gently. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do. He survived out there for years. He knows what he's doing." "My parents knew what they were doing too," Caleb's voice cracked. "Didn't stop the mountain from killing them." Lillian didn't have an answer for that. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind and wondering if Garrick was okay, if he'd found shelter, if the cold was too much, if something had happened. She told herself she was worried because they needed him, because without him, they'd starve. But that wasn't the whole truth anymore. The first day passed uneventfully. Lillian kept busy with the normal routine, feeding chickens, hauling water, cooking, mending. Nora helped without being asked. Even Caleb chopped wood without complaint. The second day, things got harder. One of the chickens died overnight, just dead in the coop, frozen solid. That left them with 5, which meant fewer eggs, which meant less food. Then the wind picked up again, bringing snow that wasn't quite a storm, but wasn't quite nothing either. Enough to make Lillian nervous. That evening, while she was cooking dinner, Caleb suddenly stood up from the table. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Lillian stopped stirring. "Hear what?" "Listen." They all went quiet. At first there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the cabin settling, wind against wood, fire crackling. Then she heard it. A howl, long and low, close enough to make the hair on her neck stand up. "Wolves," Caleb said quietly. Nora moved closer to Lillian without thinking about it. "They're just passing through," Lillian said, trying to sound calm. "They won't bother us." But the howls kept coming. More than one wolf now. Maybe a whole pack. And they weren't passing through, they were circling. Lillian could hear them moving around the cabin, their sounds getting closer. The chickens started making panicked noises in their coop. "Get the rifle," Caleb said. Lillian's hands shook as she reached for the gun above the door. She checked that it was loaded, just like Garrick had shown her. "What do we do?" Nora whispered. "Stay inside, keep the fire high. They won't come near fire." At least that's what Lillian hoped. The wolves circled for over an hour, sometimes close enough that Lillian could hear them breathing outside the walls, sometimes farther away, their howls echoing through the trees. Caleb kept watch at the window, knife in hand. Nora sat pressed against Lillian's side, and Lillian held the rifle, praying she wouldn't have to use it. Finally, just when she thought her nerves couldn't take any more, the sounds faded. The wolves moved on, looking for easier prey. Nobody slept that night. The third day, Lillian woke up feeling wrong. Not sick exactly, just off, like her body was running on empty and didn't know how to tell her. She pushed through it anyway, fed the chickens, hauled water, started breakfast. But halfway through cooking, the room started spinning. "Lillian?" Nora's voice sounded far away. Lillian gripped the edge of the stove, trying to steady herself. The cabin tilted sideways. Her knees buckled. She heard Caleb shout something, then everything went black. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on her mattress with blankets piled on top of her. Nora sat beside her, looking scared. Caleb stood in the doorway, shifting his weight nervously. "What happened?" Lillian's voice came out rough. "You passed out," Caleb said. "Hit your head on the way down. You've been out for almost an hour." Lillian tried to sit up. The room spun again, and she fell back. Don't move, Nora said. You're sick. I'm fine. Just tired. You're burning up, Caleb said. And you haven't been eating enough. I've watched you. You give most of your food to us. Because they needed it more. Because they were children. Because she'd rather go hungry than watch them starve. But she couldn't say that now. Couldn't even keep her eyes open. The fever took hold fast. Lillian drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of Nora putting cold cloths on her forehead, of Caleb trying to get her to drink water, of time passing in ways that didn't make sense. Sometimes she thought she heard Garrick's voice, but that was impossible. He wasn't back yet. Sometimes she dreamed about the saloon, about warm rooms and regular meals and not being responsible for anyone's survival but her own. Sometimes she woke up crying and didn't know why. Through it all, Caleb and Nora took care of her. Caleb kept the fire going, cooked meals, hauled water, did all the tasks Lillian had been doing. Nora stayed by her side, talking to her even when Lillian couldn't respond, making sure she drank, adjusting blankets. The children she'd come here to take care of were taking care of her instead. On what might have been the fourth day, Lillian had lost track. She woke to the sound of horses outside. The door banged open, boots on the floor. Garrick's voice, sharp with something that might have been fear. What happened? She collapsed 3 days ago, Caleb said. Fever won't break. We've tried everything. Lillian felt a rough hand against her forehead, felt Garrick go very still. She's burning alive, he said quietly. I know. I don't know what else to do. There was movement. Garrick lifting her like she weighed nothing, carrying her closer to the fire, wrapping her in fresh blankets. Did you give her willow bark tea? He asked. We don't have any, Nora said. We ran out weeks ago. I brought some from town. Caleb, boil water. Nora, get me clean cloths. The children moved quickly, efficiently, like they'd been doing this for days, which Lillian realized they had been. Garrick stayed beside her, his hand against her face. When she opened her eyes, she found him staring down at her with an expression she couldn't read. You're an idiot, he said quietly, starving yourself to feed everyone else. What were you thinking? They're children, Lillian managed. They need it more. And what good are you to them dead? She didn't have an answer for that. He made her drink this bitter willow bark tea, made her eat broth even though her stomach rebelled, sat beside her while the fever raged and her body shook with chills. At some point, late that night maybe, or early morning, Lillian woke to find him still there, still watching. You should sleep, she whispered. So should you. I'm trying. Try harder. But there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. Garrick? Yeah? Thank you for coming back. His hand found hers in the darkness. Rough, calloused, warm. Where else would I go? He said. The fever broke at dawn. Lillian woke up weak and shaky, but clear-headed for the first time in days. Her whole body ached, her head pounded, but the fire in her blood had finally gone out. Garrick was asleep in a chair beside her bed, his head tilted at an angle that was going to leave his neck screaming when he woke up. Nora was curled up on the floor nearby, wrapped in a blanket. Caleb stood by the stove making coffee. When he saw Lillian was awake, something that might have been relief crossed his face. You're not dead, he said. Disappointed? Little bit, but he was almost smiling. Garrick stirred and opened his eyes. When he saw her awake, truly awake, tension bled out of his shoulders. How do you feel? He asked. Like I got trampled by your horse. Close enough. He stood up, wincing as his back protested. You need to eat. Real food, not broth. I need to get back to work. You need to rest. Caleb and Nora have been handling things. They'll keep handling them until you're stronger. Lillian looked at the children. At Caleb, who'd kept the household running. At Nora, who'd barely left her side. Thank you, she said quietly. Both of you. Nora came over and hugged her carefully. Caleb just nodded, but it was enough. Over the next week, Lillian slowly recovered. She learned that Caleb had taken over all her tasks without complaint, that he'd figured out how to make bread that didn't burn, that he'd kept the fire going, the water hauled, the chickens fed, all while taking care of Nora and watching over Lillian. She learned that Nora had barely slept, convinced that if she left Lillian alone, she'd die like her parents had died. And she learned that Garrick had ridden through a storm to get back to them faster. that he'd been terrified he'd arrived too late, that he'd sat beside her bed for 3 days straight without sleeping. Something had shifted while she was sick. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, even though the temperature hadn't changed. Caleb started talking to her at meals, started asking her opinion on things, started treating her like she belonged there. Nora stopped watching her like she might disappear and started acting like she was permanent. And Garrick looked at her differently, like he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, they sat by the fire together, not speaking, just existing in the same space. "I was wrong about you," Garrick said finally. Lillian looked up. "Wrong how? I thought you were fragile, thought you'd break under the weight of this place." He stared into the flames. "But you're not fragile, you're just stubborn?" "I was going to say strong, but stubborn works too." "I'm not strong, Garrick. I'm just doing what needs doing." "That's what strength is." He turned to face her. "You collapsed because you were giving everything you had to keep us alive. You almost died taking care of my family. How is that not strong?" "It's just—" Lillian struggled for words. "It's what anyone would do." "No, it's not. Most people would have left. Would have taken that $200 and disappeared the first chance they got. But you stayed. You stayed when it got hard, when it got impossible. You stayed when your body was failing and you had every reason to quit." His voice dropped lower. "You stayed when I wouldn't have blamed you for running." Lillian's throat tightened. "Where would I run to?" "Anywhere back to town. Somewhere warm, somewhere easier." "This is my home now," she said quietly. "These are my people. I don't have anywhere else." Garrick reached over and took her hand, the same way he had when she was sick, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like a promise. "Neither do I," he said. They sat there in this firelight, hands clasped, while outside the mountain wind howled and the temperature dropped and winter pressed down on them with all its brutal weight. But inside the cabin, 4 broken people had finally started to feel like something that might, against all odds, become a family. 2 weeks after Lillian recovered, the real winter arrived. Not the cold they'd been enduring, not the storms they'd already survived. This was something else entirely, a brutal, relentless assault that turned the mountains into a frozen tomb where everything living either adapted or died. The temperature dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground. Snow fell in sheets that blocked out the sun for days at a time. Wind screamed through the valley like something wounded and angry, rattling the cabin walls until Lillian was sure they'd collapse. And the supplies started running out faster than anyone had planned. Garrick had restocked in town, but he'd been gone longer than expected dealing with Lillian's illness. They'd burned through firewood at twice the normal rate, keeping her fever down. The chickens had stopped laying completely in the extreme cold. And 4 people ate more than 3, no matter how carefully they rationed. "We've got maybe 6 weeks of flour left," Garrick said one morning, staring at the dwindling stores. "Less if we're not careful." "How long until spring?" Lillian asked. 10 weeks, maybe 12. The math didn't work, and everyone knew it. "We'll make it stretch," Caleb said. But his voice carried doubt. They started eating less. Thinner soup, smaller portions of bread. 1 meal a day instead of 2 when they could manage it. Nobody complained, but Lillian could see the hunger in their faces, could feel it gnawing at her own stomach. Garrick spent longer hours checking traps, trying to bring in enough game to supplement their stores. Some days he'd come back with a rabbit or 2. Other days, nothing. The animals were smart. They'd gone deep into their dens and weren't coming out until the weather broke. Caleb went with him when he could, learning to track, to set snares, to read the forest in ways that might keep him alive someday. The boy was changing, growing harder and quieter, like the mountain was carving away everything soft and leaving only what was necessary. Lillian and Nora held down the cabin. Hauling water became a brutal daily battle. The creek kept freezing over and breaking through the ice took longer each time. Chopping wood left Lillian's hands bleeding even through gloves. The chickens needed constant care just to stay alive in their poorly insulated coop. Every task was a fight. Every day was survival. One afternoon, while Garrick and Caleb were out checking the trap lines, Lillian was trying to patch a new hole in the cabin wall where wind had worked a board loose. Her fingers were so numb she could barely hold the hammer. "You're doing it wrong. Nora said from her spot by the fire. Then come show me how to do it right. Nora came over and took the hammer. Her small hands worked the nail in at an angle that actually held the board in place. Daddy taught me, she said quietly. Before. That word carried everything. The life she'd lost, the parents she'd never see again, the security that had vanished in an instant under tons of snow. He taught you good, Lillian said. They worked together in silence, securing the board. When they finished, Nora didn't move away. Are you going to leave? She asked. Lillian looked at her, surprised. Why would you think that? Everyone leaves. Mama and Daddy left. Even when they didn't want to. People always leave. I'm not leaving, Nora. You promise? Lillian wanted to promise, wanted to give this child the certainty she desperately needed. But she'd learned not to make promises she might not be able to keep. I'm going to try my hardest to stay, she said instead. That's the best I can do. Nora studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Like she understood that honesty was worth more than empty promises. That night, Garrett came back empty-handed and frustrated. He'd been gone since before dawn, and all he had to show for it was frostbite on 2 fingers and exhaustion that made him move like an old man. Nothing? Lillian asked. Tracks everywhere, but nothing in the traps. Something's checking them before I do. Probably a fox or a marten, smart enough to steal the bait without getting caught. Can you trap it? I can try, but it's using my traps to feed itself. Every piece of bait I put out is just feeding whatever's stealing from us. He sat down heavily by the fire, wincing as feeling came back to his frozen fingers. Lillian brought him coffee and watched him cradle the cup like it was the most precious thing in the world. We're going to run out of food, he said quietly, so the children wouldn't hear. I know. I might need to make another run to town, before the next big storm. That's too dangerous. You barely made it back last time. Staying here and starving is dangerous too. Lillian sat down beside him. How bad is it really? Garrick was quiet for a long time. Bad. Even if I get more supplies, I don't know if we can make it to spring, not all 4 of us. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Don't say that in front of the children, Lillian said. I won't. But you need to know the truth. If it comes down to it, if we have to choose, we're not choosing. We're all getting through this together. Lillian. Together, she repeated firmly. I didn't survive this long just to watch anyone starve. We'll figure something out. Garrick looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been despair. You really believe that? I have to. The next morning, Caleb woke up coughing. Not the normal clearing your throat cough. The deep rattling kind that came from the chest and didn't stop. By noon, he had a fever. By evening, he couldn't get out of bed. Lillian's stomach dropped when she saw him. She'd already watched one person in this cabin fight a fever. She knew how fast things could go wrong. It's just a cold, Caleb insisted between coughing fits. You're burning up, Garrick said, his hand against Caleb's forehead. His face had gone carefully blank, which meant he was scared. I'm fine. Just need to sleep it off. But he wasn't fine. Over the next 2 days, the cough got worse. His fever climbed. He started having trouble breathing, short, shallow gasps that made Lillian's own chest hurt in sympathy. Nora watched from the corner, her face pale. She'd heard those sounds before, when her parents were dying. He's going to be okay, Lillian told her, trying to sound certain. That's what Daddy said about Mama, Nora whispered, right before she stopped breathing. Garrick made willow bark tea. Lillian kept cold cloths on Caleb's forehead. They took turns sitting with him through the night, listening to him struggle for air. On the 3rd day, Caleb started coughing up blood. Garrick saw it first. His face went white. We need a doctor, he said. The nearest doctor is in town, Lillian said. That's a 2-day ride in good weather. In this storm, I know. Garrick's voice was tight. But if we don't get help, he's going to die. The words hit like a physical blow. There has to be something else we can do, Lillian said. Some medicine, some treatment. I don't know what it is. I've kept people alive through injuries, through exposure, but this... He gestured helplessly at Caleb's laboring chest. This is beyond me. Then we figure it out, together. They tried everything, steam from boiling water to help him breathe, poultices on his chest. Every folk remedy Garrick had ever learned. Nothing worked. Caleb kept getting worse. That night, while Nora slept and Caleb drifted in and out of fevered consciousness, Garrick sat by the fire with his head in his hands. "I can't lose him," he said quietly. "I can't lose another one." Lillian sat down beside him. "Tell me." "Tell you what?" "About the others. The ones you lost before." Garrick was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he started talking, his voice rough and low. "I had a wife once, Sarah. Met her in Wyoming, married her against her family's wishes because they thought I was too rough, too poor, not good enough for their daughter. Maybe they were right. Brought her up here, promised her we'd build something good. She lasted 2 years before the loneliness and the cold broke her. Left one morning while I was out hunting, walked back to town and never came back." He stared into the fire. "Had a partner after that. Not romantically, just another trapper who thought 2 men could survive better than one alone. His name was James. Good man, smart, strong. Then one winter he fell through the ice crossing the creek. I pulled him out, but the damage was done. Pneumonia took him 3 days later. I was holding his hand when he died. Garrick! And now Caleb." His voice cracked. "That boy's been through hell already. Lost his parents in the worst way possible. Started to trust this place, trust me. And now he's dying in the same bed where James died, coughing the same way, and I can't do a damn thing to stop it." "He's not dying," Lillian said firmly. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do, because we're not giving up on him. What else is there to try?" Lillian thought about it, thought about everything they'd already done and everything they hadn't. Then it hit her. "The town. We can't get a doctor here, but maybe we can get medicine. There's got to be something." "I told you, it's 2 days in this weather. He doesn't have 2 days." "Then you ride faster. You leave now, ride through the night, get what you need, and come back. I'll keep him alive until you do." Garrick looked at her like she was insane. "You want me to ride 15 miles through a blizzard in the dark? I could die out there." "And he'll definitely die if you stay here." Lillian met his eyes. "You said it yourself. This is beyond what you know how to fix. But someone in town might know. The pharmacist, the midwife, someone. You have to try. If I leave, you'll be alone with 2 children and no way to defend yourself if something goes wrong. I have the rifle. I know how to use it. And nothing's going to go wrong because you're going to make it to town and back before anything has a chance to." "Lillian, go!" She grabbed his arm. "Please, he needs this. We need this. I need you to trust that I can hold things together here while you're gone." Something shifted in Garrick's expression. He stood up, already reaching for his coat. "Keep the fire high. Keep him warm. Keep him breathing. That's all that matters." "I will. If he stops breathing, you put your mouth over his and breathe for him. You understand? You don't let him go." "I won't." Garrick grabbed his rifle, his pack, everything he'd need for a hard ride. At the door, he stopped and turned back. "If something happens to me out there, nothing's going to happen. If it does, you take the children and head south at first light. Don't wait for me. There's a trapper named Red Murphy about 6 miles that direction. He'll help you get to town." "Garrick, promise me." "I promise. Now go." He left without another word, disappearing into the storm. Lillian stood at the door, watching until the darkness swallowed him completely. Then she barred it, fed the fire, and went to sit beside Caleb. The boy was barely conscious. His skin burned with fever. His breathing came in shallow, painful gasps. Blood flecked his lips, flecked. "You're going to be okay," Lillian told him, even though she wasn't sure she believed it. "Garrick's getting help. You just have to hold on a little longer." Caleb's eyes flickered open. "Hurts," he whispered. "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't want to die like they did." Lillian's throat tightened. "You're not going to die. I won't let you. Can't stop it. Nobody can. Watch me." She spent the night fighting for his life. Every time his breathing got too shallow, she'd shake him awake. Every time his fever spiked, she'd change the cold cloths. Every time he started coughing up more blood, she'd help him sit up so he wouldn't choke. Nora woke up around midnight and came to help without being asked. The little girl brought fresh water, kept the fire going, and sat on the other side of Caleb's bed holding his hand. "He's strong," Nora said quietly. "Stronger than Mama was. He'll make it." Yes, he will. But as the night wore on, Lillian wasn't so sure. Caleb kept getting worse. His fever wouldn't break. His breathing got more labored. Twice he stopped breathing completely, and Lillian had to do exactly what Garrick had told her, breathe for him until his lungs remembered how to work on their own. Dawn came gray and cold. Caleb was still alive, but barely, and Garrick wasn't back yet. How much longer? Nora asked. I don't know, sweetheart. What if he doesn't come back? He will. He promised. But the morning dragged into afternoon, and still no Garrick. Lillian tried not to think about what that might mean, tried not to imagine him frozen in the snow somewhere, his horse lost, his body giving up. She focused on Caleb, on keeping him breathing, on keeping him alive for just one more hour, then one more after that. Nora fell asleep curled up on the floor beside the bed, exhausted from 2 days of fear and worry. Lillian kept her vigil alone, watching Caleb's chest rise and fall in irregular patterns that scared her more every time. The sun was setting when she heard it, hoofbeats, fast and hard. Lillian ran to the window. Through the falling snow, she could see a rider coming up the path at a speed that seemed impossible on this terrain. Garrick, alive, back. She had the door open before he'd even dismounted. He stumbled inside, his face red and raw from windburn, ice in his beard, his whole body shaking from cold and exhaustion. But in his hands was a small leather bag. Got it, he gasped. Pharmacist said pneumonia, gave me these. He couldn't even finish the sentence. He just thrust the bag at Lillian and collapsed against the wall. Inside were glass bottles with labels Lillian couldn't read and instructions she didn't understand. But there was also a note in cramped handwriting explaining dosages and frequency. She got the first dose into Caleb within minutes, then another 2 hours later, then another after that. Garrick had recovered enough to take over Caleb's care while Lillian forced him to eat and drink something. He'd ridden for almost 30 hours straight with only brief stops to rest the horse. His hands were frostbitten again. His lips were cracked and bleeding. He could barely stand, but he'd made it back. You're insane, Lillian told him. Probably. You could have died out there. Yeah. Thank you. Garrick looked at her, then at Caleb. He better pull through. I didn't ride through hell for nothing. He will. Because you just gave him a fighting chance. The medicine worked slowly. It took 2 more days before Caleb's fever finally broke. Another day before his breathing eased enough that he could sleep without choking. But gradually, impossibly, he started to improve. A week after Garrick's desperate ride, Caleb sat up on his own for the first time. He was weak and pale, and he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, but he was alive. You look terrible, he told Garrick. You look worse. Fair enough. Nora burst into tears and threw herself at her brother, hugging him so hard he winced. But he hugged her back just as tightly. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Lillian and Garrick sat by the fire in exhausted silence. I thought we'd lost him, Garrick said finally. So did I. When I was out there riding through that storm, I kept thinking, what if I don't make it back? What if they're all alone when he dies? What if I fail them again? But you didn't. This time. What about next time? We'll handle next time when it comes. Garrick turned to look at her. You really believed I'd make it back, didn't you? Even when it seemed impossible. I had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. You held this family together while I was gone. You kept him alive when I couldn't. He stopped, struggling for words. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't need to thank me. We're family now. That's what family does. The word hung between them. Family. Not a marriage of convenience, not a business arrangement. Family. Yeah, Garrick said quietly. I guess we are. He reached over and took her hand. Not like before. Tentative and uncertain. This time his grip was sure. Steady. Lillian squeezed back. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell and the mountain pressed down on them with all its merciless weight. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Something had locked into place that couldn't be undone. They'd survived together. Not perfectly. Not without cost. But they'd survived. And somehow, that mattered more than any promise or any plan. The next few weeks were still brutal. Caleb's recovery was slow, and he couldn't do the heavy work he'd been handling before. That meant more fell on Garrick, who was already exhausted from his ride to town. More fell on Lillian, who was running on fumes and stubbornness. The food situation got worse. They were down to one meal a day most days. The chickens produced almost nothing. The traps stayed empty. Hunting in the deep snow was nearly impossible. Everyone was hungry all the time. Everyone was tired. Everyone was scared, though nobody said it out loud. One morning, Lillian woke up to find Garrick already gone. Not unusual. He often left before dawn to check traps or hunt. But something felt different. She found the note on the table. Taking the horse, going to try the high country. Might be gone 3 days. Keep the fire high and the door barred. G. The high country, where the snow was deeper and the temperatures even colder and the risks even greater, but also where the game might still be moving, where desperate hunters went when there was nowhere else to try. Where'd he go? Caleb asked, reading over her shoulder. Hunting. In the high country? That's crazy. Nobody goes up there in winter. Your uncle's not nobody. He could die up there. Yes, he could. Lillian folded the note carefully. But we could die down here if he doesn't bring back food. So he went. They waited. 1 day passed, then 2. The supplies kept dwindling. The hunger kept growing. Nora stopped asking when Garrick would be back. Caleb got quieter and more withdrawn. On the 3rd day, a storm rolled in worse than anything they'd seen yet. Wind that sounded like screaming. Snow so thick you couldn't see 5 feet. Temperature that made the inside of the cabin feel like standing outside. Lillian kept the fire as high as she dared, knowing they were burning through wood faster than they should, but unable to let the children freeze. Night fell. Still no Garrick. He's not coming back, Caleb said flatly. Yes, he is. Nobody survives the high country in a storm like this. You know that. Your uncle survived worse. You don't know that. You don't actually know anything about him. Lillian turned to face the boy. I know he rode through a blizzard for 30 hours straight to save your life. I know he's out there right now risking everything to make sure we don't starve. I know he's the strongest, most stubborn man I've ever met. And if anyone can make it back, it's him. And if you're wrong, then we figure out what comes next. But I'm not wrong. The storm raged all night. Lillian didn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the darkness, listening for sounds that never came. Dawn broke gray and brutal. The storm hadn't let up. Snow had drifted against the cabin door so high they'd have to dig themselves out. Still no Garrick. Lillian made thin soup from the last of their beans and a few scraps of dried meat. The children ate without complaint, though she could see the fear in their eyes. She was starting to consider Garrick's backup plan, head to Red Murphy's place at first light tomorrow if Garrick wasn't back, when Nora suddenly sat up straight. Listen, she whispered. Lillian held her breath. There, barely audible over the wind, a sound that might have been a horse. She ran to the door and started digging through the snowdrift with her bare hands. Caleb joined her, the two of them frantically clearing a path. The door finally opened. Through the swirling snow, a figure emerged, man-shaped but covered in so much ice he barely looked human, leading a horse that was limping badly. Garrick. He stumbled into the cabin and collapsed just inside the door. Lillian caught him before he hit the ground. Got a deer, he managed through chattering teeth. On the horse, big one. Then he passed out. It took all 3 of them to get him out of his frozen clothes and wrapped in blankets by the fire. His hands and feet were white with frostbite. His face was raw and bleeding from windburn. His whole body shook with cold that had settled into his bones. But he was alive. And on the horse, frozen solid but still good, was the carcass of a deer big enough to feed them for weeks. Lillian sat beside Garrick while his body slowly thawed, watching his chest rise and fall, making sure he kept breathing the same way she'd made sure Caleb kept breathing. Caleb and Nora worked together to bring in the deer, to start processing the meat before it froze completely. They moved with quiet efficiency, these 2 children who'd learned far too young how to survive. When Garrick finally woke up hours later, the first thing he saw was Lillian's face. Told you I'd come back, he mumbled. You're an idiot. Yeah. He tried to sit up and winced. But an idiot with a deer. That deer nearly cost me you. Would have been worth it. You can't eat me. Don't tempt me right now. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Over the next few days, Garrick recovered slowly from his ordeal while the deer meat restored some desperately needed calories to everyone's diet. It wasn't much, they still had to ration carefully, but it was enough. Enough to push back the immediate threat of starvation. Enough to give them hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make it to spring. But the cost had been high. Garrick lost 2 toes to frostbite. The horse had damaged a leg in the high country and would never be the same. And everyone in the cabin now understood just how close to the edge they were living. One night, while Garrick was still recovering and the children slept, Lillian sat beside him rewrapping his damaged feet. "You can't do that again," she said quietly. "Had to be done. Not like that. Not at that risk. What else was I supposed to do? Let us starve? We could have managed somehow, found another way." Garrick caught her hand, stopping her. "Lillian, look at me." She did. "This is what survival looks like out here," he said. "It's not pretty, it's not safe. Sometimes it's desperate and stupid and way too close to disaster. But it's all we've got. I need you to understand that." "I do understand. That's why I'm scared." "Good. Being scared means you're paying attention." His grip tightened. "But being scared can't stop us from doing what needs doing. Can't stop us from taking risks when there's no other choice. And what if next time you don't come back? What if next time I'm sitting here with 2 children and no idea what to do and nobody coming to save us? Then you do what you've been doing. You survive. You fight. You keep them alive until you figure out the next step." "I can't do this alone, Garrick." "You won't have to. I'm not planning on dying anytime soon. People never plan on it. It just happens." He pulled her closer until their faces were only inches apart. "I promise you, I will fight like hell to come back every single time. Because this," he gestured at the cabin, at the sleeping children, at everything they'd built together, "this is the only thing that's mattered to me in 10 years. I'm not giving it up without a fight." Lillian's eyes burned. "We're not a charity case, Garrick. We're not just something for you to protect." "I know that. You think I don't know that? You're the strongest person I've ever met. Those kids are fighters. But strength doesn't mean going it alone. It means knowing when to lean on the people who care about you." "Do you?" The words came out before she could stop them. "Care about me?" Garrick's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do. More than I probably should." "Why shouldn't you?" "Because caring about people gives the mountain leverage, gives it something to take away when it decides you've had enough good fortune." "So what? You just never let yourself feel anything? Never let anyone get close?" "I tried that. Didn't work." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "You made damn sure it didn't work." "I didn't do anything. You showed up. You stayed. You fought for my family like they were your own. You made me believe maybe this could be something real instead of just a survival arrangement." His voice dropped lower. "You made me feel things I swore I'd never feel again." Lillian's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What kind of things?" "The dangerous kind." He leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate and real, and full of everything they'd both been holding back for weeks. Lillian kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands tangling in his hair, all the fear and exhaustion and longing pouring out in that single moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrick rested his forehead against hers. "This changes things," he said. "I know. If we do this, if we make this real, there's no taking it back. No pretending it's just a business arrangement anymore." "I don't want to pretend." "You sure?" "Because I'm not an easy man to love, Lillian. I'm rough and hard, and I've got more scars than sense. I live in the middle of nowhere, and I'll probably never be anything more than a trapper barely scraping by. You deserve better than that." "I don't want better. I want you." Something broke open in Garrick's expression. Relief and wonder and fear all tangled together. "Then you've got me," he said, "for whatever that's worth." "It's worth everything." They sat there in the firelight, holding each other while the mountain wind howled outside and the future remained uncertain and the risks stayed just as high as they'd always been. But for the first time since Lillian had stepped into that saloon and volunteered for this impossible life, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Hope. Not the naive kind. Not the belief that everything would be easy or safe or perfect, but the kind of hope that came from knowing she wasn't facing the darkness alone anymore. That whatever came next, storms or hunger or loss or pain, they'd face it together. And somehow, that made even the impossible seem survivable. The kiss changed everything and nothing at the same time. Garrick still woke before dawn to check traps. Lillian still hauled water and cooked and mended. Caleb still chopped wood when his recovering lungs allowed it. Nora still fed the chickens twice a day without complaint. But now, when Garrick came back from the cold, he'd find Lillian first. A brief touch of hands, a look that lasted half a second longer than necessary. Small moments stolen between the endless work of survival. And at night, after the children slept, they'd sit close by the fire. Sometimes talking. Sometimes just existing in the same space, shoulders touching, hands clasped. It wasn't romance like the stories Lillian had read as a girl. There were no flowers or poetry or grand declarations, just two exhausted people finding comfort in each other while winter tried its damnedest to kill them all. The children noticed, of course. Kids always did. "You kiss him yet?" Nora asked one morning while they were washing dishes. Lillian nearly dropped the plate she was holding. "That's not appropriate to ask." "That means yes." Nora grinned. "Good. He's less grumpy now." "He's always grumpy." "Less grumpy," Nora insisted. "And you smile more. I like it when you smile." Caleb's reaction was more complicated. He didn't say anything directly, but Lillian caught him watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not disapproval, exactly. More like wariness. One afternoon, while Garrick was out and Nora was napping, Lillian found Caleb sitting on his bed, staring at nothing. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine." "You've been quiet lately, more than usual." Caleb shrugged. "Just thinking." "About what?" He was silent for a long moment, then, "You're going to stay, right? You and him, now that you're together, you're not going to change your mind and leave?" "I already told Nora I'm not leaving." "People say things, doesn't mean they're true." Lillian sat down beside him. "Your parents loved each other, didn't they?" "Yeah. So? So did they ever talk about leaving each other? About one of them just deciding to walk away?" "No. But they died. They didn't have a choice." "You're right. They didn't. But I do have a choice, and I'm choosing to stay. Not because of Garrick, though, yes, I care about him, but because this is my home now. You and Nora are my family. That doesn't change just because things between me and your uncle got more complicated." Caleb looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "Promise?" "I promise." "Okay." He stood up, conversation over in the abrupt way teenage boys had, but as he walked past, he squeezed her shoulder briefly. It was the first time he'd voluntarily touched her. February arrived with no let-up in the cold. If anything, the weather got meaner. Days were short and brutal. Nights stretched on forever. The cabin walls groaned under the weight of ice and wind. But they had food now, thanks to Garrick's deer, and they had each other. It was enough. Barely, but enough. Then Garrick's leg started giving him trouble. He'd damaged it years ago in a fall, and the cold always made it worse. But this winter, after everything he'd put his body through, the desperate ride to town, the trip to the high country, the constant physical labor, it started failing completely. Some mornings he could barely stand. Other days he'd be out working and it would just buckle under him without warning. He tried to hide it, but Lillian noticed. She always noticed. "You need to rest that leg," she told him one evening after watching him nearly fall while carrying water. "Can't rest. Too much work needs doing." "Caleb and I can handle more. You're going to hurt yourself worse." "I'm fine." "You're limping so bad you can barely walk. That's not fine." Garrick's jaw tightened. "What do you want me to do, Lillian? Sit by the fire like an invalid while you and a 15-year-old boy do all the heavy work? If that's what it takes to keep you from crippling yourself permanently, then yes. That's not how this works." "Then how does it work? You run yourself into the ground until you can't function anymore? Until something happens and you can't protect us because you destroyed your own body through stubbornness?" They were both getting loud now. Loud enough that Caleb and Nora were watching from across the cabin, pretending not to listen. "I've survived out here for 10 years doing things my way," Garrick said. "And now you're not alone anymore. Your way has to account for that." "I know that." "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're still acting like you're the only one who matters, like your body is just a tool you can use up and throw away. That's not fair. Neither is watching you hurt yourself when we need you healthy. Garrick opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. His shoulders sagged. I don't know how to not push through it. It's all I've ever known. Lillian's anger deflated. She crossed the room and took his hands. Then learn, please, for me, for the kids, for yourself. He looked down at their joined hands. What if I can't? Then we'll figure it out together, but you have to try. Okay, he said quietly. I'll try. For the next week, Garrick actually rested. He hated every minute of it. Lillian could tell by the way he watched them work, by the tension in his shoulders, by how he'd start to stand up to help, then force himself to sit back down. But he did it. Caleb stepped up in ways that surprised everyone. The boy was still recovering himself, still thin and weak from his illness, but he pushed through it. He checked the closest traps. He hauled wood. He took on tasks that were probably too much for him but refused to admit it. Lillian tried to do the rest. She was stronger now than she'd been when she first arrived. Months of brutal labor had put muscle on her thin frame, but it still wasn't enough. Some jobs were just too heavy, too dangerous, too difficult for someone her size. One morning, while trying to break ice on the creek, her foot slipped. She went down hard, cracking her knee against a rock. Pain shot up her leg so intense she couldn't breathe. By the time she limped back to the cabin, her knee had swollen to twice its normal size, and she couldn't put weight on it. Garrick took one look and cursed. What happened? Slipped on the ice. You need to stay off it. Elevate it. We'll use cold compresses to bring down the swelling. I'm fine. Garrick raised an eyebrow. Sound familiar? Despite the pain, Lillian almost laughed. Point taken. So now they were both hobbling around like a pair of old folks, neither one able to do the full range of necessary tasks. Caleb and Nora picked up the slack without being asked, these two children who'd already grown up too fast becoming even more capable out of sheer necessity. We're a mess, Lillian said one night, watching Garrick massage his bad leg while she kept her knee elevated. Yeah. How do broken people keep other broken people alive? Carefully, and with a lot of luck. We're running low on luck. We'll make more. He shifted position, wincing. That's all survival is, really. Making your own luck through sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. Is that what we're doing? Refusing to quit? Every single day. Lillian's knee healed slowly over the next few weeks. Garrick's leg improved some with rest, though it would never be what it was. But they adapted. Caleb learned to set traps on his own. Nora figured out how to chop kindling. They all took on pieces of the work, distributing it among 4 people instead of expecting 1 or 2 to carry everything. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't pretty, but it worked. March came in cold, but with a subtle shift in the light. Days were getting longer, even if they weren't getting warmer yet. Snow still fell regularly, but not with the same brutal intensity. The worst of winter was behind them, though spring felt impossibly far away. Then Garrick made a mistake that nearly cost him everything. He'd gone out to check the trap line, insisting his leg was fine even though everyone could see it wasn't. Caleb had offered to go with him, but Garrick had refused. I've been doing this alone for 10 years, he'd said. I can handle it. He'd been gone for 3 hours when Lillian started to worry. The trap line wasn't that far. He should have been back by now. 4 hours. 5. Something's wrong, she told Caleb. Maybe he just found good tracks and followed them. In this cold? With his bad leg? No, something's wrong. 6 hours. Lillian couldn't wait anymore. She grabbed the rifle, told Nora to stay inside and keep the fire going, and headed out with Caleb to find Garrick. They followed his tracks through the snow. Easy enough to read, boot prints, the drag mark where his bad leg scraped, the occasional handprint where he'd caught himself from falling. Half a mile out, they found where he'd checked the first trap. Empty. Then the second. Also empty. Then the third. At the 4th trap, the tracks told a story Lillian didn't want to read. Garrick had approached the trap, had bent down to check it. Then his tracks scattered, several stumbling steps, a depression in the snow where he'd fallen, handprints where he'd tried to get up. And blood. Not much, but enough. "Uncle Garrick!" Caleb shouted, his voice cracking. No response. They followed the disturbed snow and found him about 20 yards from the trap, sitting propped against a tree with his legs stretched out in front of him at an angle that made Lillian's stomach turn. His face was gray, his eyes were closed. For one horrible moment, she thought they were too late. Then he opened his eyes and looked at them. "Leg gave out," he said through clenched teeth. "Fell wrong. Think I broke it." Lillian knelt beside him, her own knee protesting. The leg was definitely broken. She could see the unnatural bend even through his pants. "We need to get you back to the cabin," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can't walk." "We'll carry you." "I'm twice your size. You can't." "We're not leaving you here to freeze." Lillian looked at Caleb. "We'll make a travois. Cut some branches, use my coat to make a sling. We can drag him back." Caleb was already moving, pulling out the knife Garrick had taught him to carry. It took them almost 2 hours to rig something that would work and get Garrick onto it. He passed out twice from the pain. Each time, Lillian's heart stopped until he came back around. Getting him back to the cabin took another 3 hours of brutal labor, dragging his weight through snow, over rough ground, around obstacles. Lillian's knee gave out twice. Caleb had to stop every few minutes to catch his breath, his damaged lungs struggling with the exertion. But they made it. Nora had kept the fire roaring and boiled water without being told. Smart kid. Getting Garrick inside and onto his bed was another nightmare. By the time they managed it, all 3 of them were shaking with exhaustion. Lillian cut away Garrick's pant leg and nearly threw up at what she found. The break was bad. Bone pushing against skin, already swelling and discoloring. "We need to set it," she said. "I know." Garrick's voice was faint. "You'll have to do it." "I don't know how." "I'll talk you through it. But you need to do it now, before the swelling gets worse." What followed was the worst hour of Lillian's life. Garrick told her what to do, and she did it, even though every instinct screamed at her to stop. Caleb held his uncle's shoulders down. Nora gripped his hand and didn't let go, even when he squeezed hard enough to hurt. When the bone finally snapped back into place, Garrick screamed, then passed out. Lillian splinted the leg as best she could with boards and strips of cloth. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the knots. "Is he going to die?" Nora asked in a small voice. "No," Lillian said, even though she had no idea if that was true. "He's tough. He'll be okay." But infection was the real risk now. In the warmth of the cabin, with the break as bad as it was, infection could set in fast. And if it did, there was nothing they could do. No doctor within 2 days' ride, no medicine that would help. All they could do was keep the wound clean and hope. Garrick developed a fever that night. Not as bad as Caleb's had been, but bad enough. Lillian sat beside him, changing cold compresses, forcing water between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. Caleb took over everything else, feeding the fire, making food, taking care of Nora. The boy moved through the cabin like a ghost, his face set in grim determination. On the second day, Lillian noticed the wound starting to smell wrong. The skin around it was hot and angry-looking. Infection. She cleaned it with boiled water and the last of their alcohol, which made Garrick wake up screaming again. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. If the infection spread, he'd lose the leg, or worse. "You're tougher than you look," Garrick mumbled when the worst of it was over. "Stop talking. Save your strength." Lillian. "What?" "If this goes bad, if I don't make it." "You're going to make it. Listen to me." He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "If I don't make it, you take the kids and go. Don't try to stay here. You can't run this place alone." "I'm not leaving." "You have to. There's money buried behind the cabin, under the 3rd board from the northeast corner, enough to get you back to town and set up somewhere. Promise me you'll use it." "Garrick, promise me." "Fine, I promise. Now shut up and focus on not dying." The fever peaked on the 3rd day. Garrick drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes delirious. When he was delirious, he talked to people who weren't there. His dead wife, Sarah. His old partner, James. People from a past Lillian didn't know. When he was lucid, he looked at Lillian like he was memorizing her face. "I love you," he said during one of the clear moments. Lillian's breath caught. "What?" "I love you. Should have said it before, but I'm saying it now, in case I don't get another chance." "You'll get plenty of chances. You're not dying." "Lillian, I love you too, you stubborn idiot, which is why you're going to fight this. You're going to get better, and then we're going to have a very long conversation about you taking stupid risks with your life." He smiled faintly, looking forward to it. Then he slipped back into fever dreams. That night was the worst. His temperature spiked so high Lillian thought his brain might cook. She packed him in cold compresses, forced water down his throat every few minutes, and prayed to whoever might be listening that he'd survive until morning. Caleb and Nora stayed up with her. The three of them taking turns, none of them willing to leave Garrick alone. "He saved me," Caleb said quietly around midnight. "When I was sick, rode through hell to get medicine. I can't—" His voice broke. "I can't lose him too." "You won't," Lillian said. "We won't let you." Dawn came gray and cold, and Garrick's fever broke. The infection didn't disappear. It would be weeks before it fully cleared. But the worst had passed. He was weak as a kitten and in constant pain, but alive. Lillian collapsed beside his bed and cried for the first time since arriving at the cabin. Not quiet tears. Full-body sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded and terrified. Garrick's hand found hers. "Hey, I'm okay. You almost weren't. But I am, thanks to you. I didn't do anything. You kept me alive, you and Caleb and Nora. You didn't give up on me." "Of course we didn't. You're family." "Yeah," Garrick said softly. "We are." Recovery was slow and frustrating. Garrick couldn't walk for weeks. Even sitting up left him dizzy and weak. He was completely dependent on the others for everything, which drove him half crazy with frustration. But it also forced him to learn something he'd never been good at, accepting help. Lillian brought him meals and changed his bandages and kept him company when the pain got bad. Caleb read to him from the few books they had, his voice filling the cabin with stories of places none of them had ever seen. Nora sat beside him and talked about everything and nothing, her chatter a distraction from the monotony of being bedridden. "I'm useless like this," Garrick said one afternoon. "You're healing," Lillian corrected. "That's not useless. I should be out working, providing, protecting." "You'll do all that again, when you're ready. Right now your job is to get better. And in the meantime we handle it, the four of us together." "You shouldn't have to." "Maybe not, but we do anyway. That's what family means." Garrick looked at her for a long moment. "How did I get so lucky?" "Lucky? You broke your leg." "I meant you. How did I get lucky enough that you walked into that saloon?" Lillian smiled. "I ask myself the same thing sometimes. How I got lucky enough that you needed a wife." "This isn't what you signed up for." "No, it's not. It's harder and scarier and more exhausting than I ever imagined. But it's also—" She struggled to find the words. "It's also real. More real than anything I had before. And I wouldn't trade it. Not even for a warm room and regular meals. Not even for that." As the weeks passed and Garrick slowly healed, spring finally started showing itself. The snow began melting in earnest. Ice on the creek thinned and cracked. The temperature climbed above freezing during the day, even if it still dropped at night. Birds returned. Green shoots pushed up through the mud. The chickens started laying again. The mountain was waking up. And so was hope. Garrick graduated from bed to chair to crutches Caleb had made from tree branches. His leg would never be the same. The break had been too severe. But he'd walk again. Maybe with a limp worse than before, but he'd walk. The day he managed to make it from the cabin to the creek and back without help, they had a celebration. Lillian made actual bread with flour they could now afford to use more liberally. Caleb shot a rabbit. Nora picked the first wildflowers of the season. They ate until they were full for the first time in months. After the meal, Nora asked Garrick to tell a story. He wasn't much of a storyteller, but he tried. Some rambling tale about a fox outsmarting hunters that probably wasn't true but made Nora laugh anyway. Watching them, Lillian felt something shift in her chest. A settling. Like pieces falling into place after months of chaos. This was her family, broken and scarred and held together by sheer stubborn will. But hers. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Garrick found her outside watching the stars. "You okay?" he asked, settling beside her with a wince as his bad leg protested. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" About how different this is from what I imagined when I said yes to marrying you. Garrick tensed. Regrets? No. The opposite. Lillian leaned against him. I thought I was agreeing to help with some children for a few months, maybe a year. I thought it would be temporary. A job. And now I can't imagine being anywhere else, with anyone else. She looked up at him. You asked me in the saloon if I'd be okay with this not being real, with it just being a business arrangement. I remember. I need you to know, it's real now. For me, it's real. Garrick pulled her closer. It's been real for me since you collapsed from exhaustion trying to keep my family alive, maybe even before that. When? When you stood up in that saloon while everyone else sat silent. When you asked if I'd be kind. When you chose us, even though every logical reason said you shouldn't. Lillian turned to face him fully. I need to tell you something. Okay? That $200 you gave me, I still have it. I never spent any of it. Why not? Because taking it would have meant this was a transaction, and somewhere along the way, it stopped being that. It became home. Garrick kissed her then, slow and gentle, not desperate like before, like they had time now, like they'd survived the worst and could finally breathe. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. Marry me again, he said. We're already married. I know. But the first time was cold and desperate, and I didn't even look at you properly. I want to do it right this time. Want to stand in front of those kids and promise you things I actually mean. What kind of things? That I'll try to be kind, that I'll come home when I can, that I'll love you even when it's hard, even when the mountain tries to break us, even when everything goes wrong. Lillian's eyes burned. When? Tomorrow? Next week? Whenever you want. I just need you to know this isn't convenience anymore. This is choice. I choose you. I choose you too, Lillian whispered. They stayed outside until the cold drove them back in, talking about the future in ways they never had before, about making improvements to the cabin, about expanding the chicken coop, about teaching Caleb and Nora everything they'd need to survive this place, about building a life instead of just surviving. When they finally went inside, Caleb was still awake, sitting by the dying fire. Thought you'd frozen out there, he said. Just talking, Garrick replied. Caleb looked between them, then smiled slightly. About time you two figured it out. Figured what out? Lillian asked. That you're stuck with each other. All of us stuck with each other. He stood up and stretched. Good. Was getting tired of watching you dance around it. He disappeared behind his blanket wall, leaving Garrick and Lillian staring after him. Smart kid, Garrick said. Too smart, Lillian agreed. They settled by the fire for a few more minutes, just existing together in the warmth and quiet. Outside, the mountain was still there, still dangerous, still demanding, still capable of killing them if they got careless. But inside the cabin, they'd built something the mountain couldn't touch, something that had started as desperation and grown into something worth fighting for. Something that felt, against all odds, like it might actually last. Spring came slow and messy, like everything else in the mountains. The snow didn't just melt. It turned the world into mud and slush and rushing water that carved new paths through the landscape. The cabin leaked in places they'd never seen leak before. The chickens got ornery and aggressive with the warmer weather. And Garrick's healing leg ached worse on the days when storms were coming, which he hated but learned to live with. But there was also green. So much green after months of nothing but white and gray. Wildflowers pushed up through the mud. The trees budded and leafed out. The air smelled like living things instead of ice and death. They'd made it through winter. Not perfectly, not without cost. But they'd made it. The second wedding happened on a Sunday morning in late April, with no reverend and no church. Just the four of them standing in the clearing behind the cabin where the first wildflowers had bloomed. Garrick had asked Caleb to say the words, and the boy had looked terrified at first. But he'd straightened his shoulders and nodded, understanding somehow that this mattered, that marking the moment mattered. We're here because... Caleb stopped, looked down at the piece of paper where he'd written notes, then crumpled it up. I'm just going to say what I think instead of what I wrote. That's fine, Garrick said gently. Caleb took a breath. You two got married the first time because you had to, because the law said so, and because kids like me and Nora needed a home. But this time it's different. This time you're choosing each other. And that means something. He looked at Lillian. You came here when nobody else would. You stayed when anyone else would have run. You kept us alive when we should have died. You made a house in the middle of nowhere feel like a home. I don't know if I ever said thank you for that. So thank you. Lillian's eyes were already wet. Caleb turned to Garrick. You saved me and Nora when our parents died. You could have left us in that snow, but you didn't. You risked everything to keep us safe. And when he gestured at Lillian, when she came, you let her in. You let all of us become something real instead of just people surviving together. That took guts. Garrick's jaw worked, but he didn't speak. So I guess what I'm saying is, you two belong together. Anyone can see it. And we're lucky we get to be part of it. Caleb looked at Nora, who was holding a handful of wildflowers. You want to say something? Nora stepped forward and handed half the flowers to Lillian and half to Garrick. Mama used to say that family isn't just blood. It's who shows up when things get hard. You both showed up, so you're family now, really family. She stepped back, and there was a moment of silence broken only by birdsong and the distant rush of the creek. Then Garrick spoke, his voice rough. I'm not good with words. Never have been. But I need you to know that then, he looked at Lillian, you're the strongest person I've ever met. Not because you can haul water or chop wood or survive winter, but because you chose kindness when the world gave you every reason to be hard. You chose us when you could have chosen yourself. And you made me believe that maybe broken things can still be worth something. Lillian couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. I promise I'll try to be kind, Garrick continued. I'll try to come home. I'll try to be the man you deserve, even when I fall short, and I'll love you for as long as I'm breathing, maybe longer than that. Lillian found her voice, shaky, but there. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be you. The man who rides through blizzards for children who aren't his blood, who teaches a grieving boy to survive, who makes sure everyone eats before he does, who holds my hand in the dark when I'm scared. She took both his hands in hers. I promise I'll stay. When it's hard, when it's scary, when every logical reason says I should go, I'll stay because this is where I belong. With you. With them. With all of it. Then I guess you're married, Caleb said. Again. This time, when Garrick kissed her, there was nothing desperate about it. Just certainty. Like they'd both finally stopped fighting what they already knew. Nora clapped. Caleb tried not to smile and failed. And in that clearing, with mud under their feet and wildflowers in their hands, a family that had been built from necessity became something chosen. The months that followed were the best Lillian had known. They rebuilt. Not just the cabin, though they did that too, patching holes and reinforcing walls and building a proper addition so everyone had real rooms instead of blanket walls. But they rebuilt themselves. Garrick's leg healed enough that he could work again, though he'd always walk with a pronounced limp now. He taught Caleb everything he knew about tracking and trapping and surviving in country that killed the careless. The boy soaked it up like he'd been thirsty his whole life for someone to show him how to be capable. Lillian and Nora planted a garden. It was small and probably doomed to fail given the short growing season, but they tried anyway. Teaching the girl that trying mattered, even when success wasn't guaranteed. They fell into rhythms that felt almost normal. Meals together. Work shared among all of them. Evenings by the fire where they'd talk or read or just exist in comfortable silence. It wasn't easy. Work was still brutal. Resources were still tight. The mountain still demanded everything they had just to survive. But it was theirs. One evening in June, a rider appeared on the trail. The first visitor they'd had since winter. Garrick grabbed his rifle out of habit, but relaxed when he recognized the man, Red Murphy, the trapper who lived 6 miles south. Garrick Vale, Red called out as he approached. Heard you died last winter. Heard wrong. Red dismounted, grinning. Apparently. Town's been taking bets on whether you'd make it through. Some folks owe me money now. You bet on me surviving? Bet on you being too stubborn to die. Different thing. Red's eyes found Lillian. And this must be the wife everyone's talking about. Lillian, she said, shaking his hand. Pleasure, I'm Red. He looked around at the obvious improvements to the cabin. You've been busy. Place looks better than I've ever seen it. 4 sets of hands work faster than one, Garrick said. Where are the kids I heard about? Caleb emerged from the lean-to, suspicious and protective. Nora peeked out from behind Lillian. These are mine, Garrick said simply. Caleb and Nora. The word mine did something to both children. Caleb stood a little straighter. Nora smiled. Red stayed for dinner, trading news from town. Judge Hendricks had died in March. The saloon had burned down but was already being rebuilt. Mary Holloway had married a widower from 2 towns over and moved away. Lot of folks asked about you, Red told Lillian. Dutch says you're welcome back if mountain life doesn't suit you. Lillian smiled. Tell Dutch I'm right where I belong. Figured as much. You've got that look about you. What look? The look of someone who found what they were searching for, even if they didn't know they were searching. After Red left the next morning, Lillian thought about that. About how she'd been invisible in town, overlooked and forgotten. About how she'd felt like she was drowning every single day. And about how that girl who'd stood up in the saloon felt like a different person now. You've changed, Garrick said one night, echoing her thoughts. Have I? Yeah, you're... He searched for the word. Solid. Like you've grown roots. Is that good? It's everything. Summer brought its own challenges. A bear got into the chicken coop and killed 3 birds before Garrick drove it off. The garden produced exactly 4 sad carrots and some questionable lettuce. Caleb fell out of a tree and broke his arm, which meant 6 weeks of him being frustrated and Lillian doing even more work. But there was also laughter. Nora learned to swim in the creek. Caleb shot his first deer on his own and came back to the cabin beaming with pride. Garrick and Lillian stole moments alone when they could, walks in the evening, conversations that stretched late into the night, kisses that still made her heart race. In August, Caleb turned 16. They marked it with a cake Lillian made that turned out lopsided but edible. Garrick gave him a knife he'd been working on for months, the handle carved from elk antler. You're a man now, Garrick told him, old enough to make your own choices about what comes next. Caleb turned the knife over in his hands, testing the weight. What do you mean? I mean, if you want to leave when you're older, go to town, find work, see what else is out there. I won't stop you. This life isn't for everyone. You want me to go? No, but I want you to stay because you choose to, not because you think you owe me something. Caleb looked at Lillian, then Nora, then back to Garrick. This is my home. These are my people. Why would I leave? The world's bigger than this valley. Maybe, but this valley's got everything I need. Garrick pulled him into a rough hug, the first time Lillian had seen him embrace the boy like that. You're a good man, Caleb, Garrick said quietly. Your parents would be proud. Caleb's voice was muffled against Garrick's shoulder. I think they'd be glad I found you, all of you. That night, Lillian asked Garrick, would you really let him go if he wanted? Yeah, holding on to people just because you're scared to lose them. That's not love. That's possession. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just old enough to have made every mistake there is to make. Fall arrived with its usual violence. Sudden temperature drops, early snow, days that felt like winter rehearsing for its big performance. They prepared better this time. More food stored, more wood cut, more repairs made. They knew what was coming and how to survive it. But there were also moments of grace Lillian hadn't expected. Garrick teaching Nora to read from one of his few precious books, his patience infinite even when she struggled with the words. Caleb making Lillian a new chair when her old one finally collapsed, the craftsmanship better than she'd thought a 16-year-old could manage. The 4 of them sitting around the fire on the first really cold night, bundled in blankets, telling stories about nothing important. One October evening, Lillian realized she was happy. Not despite the hard work or the isolation or the constant edge of danger, but because of what they'd built in spite of all that. What are you smiling about? Garrick asked. Just thinking. About? About how I used to dream about escaping to somewhere easy, somewhere warm and safe where nothing ever went wrong. And now I know that place doesn't exist, and even if it did, I wouldn't want it, because easy doesn't teach you anything. Safe doesn't show you what you're capable of. I'd rather have this, have us, than any fantasy about perfect. Garrick kissed her forehead. We're about as far from perfect as it gets. Exactly. The second winter was different from the first. Still brutal, Still dangerous, still a daily fight for survival. But they knew what they were doing now. Knew how to ration food, how to manage firewood, how to keep each other sane when cabin fever set in. And they had each other in ways they hadn't before. Not just as people surviving together, but as a family that had chosen to be a family. Caleb grew into his strength, taking on more and more until he was handling nearly as much work as Garrick. Nora learned to cook and mend and do 100 small tasks that kept the household running. Lillian and Garrick moved through the days like partners who'd been together for decades instead of just over a year. There were hard moments. A week in January when they ran low on food again and everyone went hungry. A storm in February that nearly ripped the roof off the cabin. A morning in March when Garrick's leg gave out completely and he couldn't walk for 3 days. But there were also good moments. The first time Nora read an entire page without help. The morning Caleb brought down an elk big enough to feed them for a month. The night Lillian and Garrick sat outside wrapped in blankets, watching stars, and talking about building a bigger cabin next summer. "We could add a real bedroom," Garrick said, "with a door. Scandalous. Maybe a loft for the kids, give them more space. They'd like that. And a better stove, one that actually heats evenly." Lillian smiled. "You're planning a future." "Yeah, is that okay?" "More than okay." Spring came again, and with it the familiar cycle of melting and mud and new growth. But this time, Lillian greeted it differently. Not with relief that she'd survived, but with quiet satisfaction that they'd all survived together. One April morning, 2 years almost to the day after that first wedding, Lillian stood in the garden plot planning what to plant. The last attempt had been a disaster, but she'd learned things. This year would be better. Nora came running up, out of breath. "There's people coming!" Lillian's stomach tightened. Visitors were still rare enough to mean trouble. But when she saw who it was, she relaxed. Mary Holloway, the widow from the boarding house, riding up the trail with a man Lillian didn't recognize. "Mary?" Lillian called out. "Lillian Cross, or I suppose it's Lillian Vale now." Mary dismounted, smiling. "Look at you. I barely recognized you. What are you doing out here?" "Came to see if the rumors were true, that you actually survived." "I did more than survive. I can see that." Mary looked around at the improved cabin, the garden plot, the healthy chickens. You did all this?" "All of us did." Garrick emerged from the lean-to, Caleb behind him, both of them armed, both relaxing when they saw it was just women. "This is my husband, Thomas," Mary said, gesturing to the man beside her. "We got married last fall. He wanted to see the high country, and I wanted to see if you were still alive." "Alive and well," Lillian said. They invited Mary and Thomas to stay for a meal. Over stew and bread, they traded stories. Mary's life in the new town, Thomas's work as a blacksmith, news from Blackridge Hollow. "Dutch asks about you sometimes," Mary said. "Always wondered if you regretted it." "Regretted what?" "This. All of this. Leaving town for..." She gestured vaguely at the wilderness. "Not once," Lillian said firmly. Mary studied her face. "I believe you. You look... I don't know how to describe it. Complete, maybe. Like you found the piece that was missing." "I found a lot of pieces. Found myself, mostly." After Mary and Thomas left, Garrick found Lillian standing alone in the clearing where they'd married the second time. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah, just thinking about who I used to be. That girl in the saloon? That girl who was so desperate to be seen that she volunteered to marry a stranger and disappear into the mountains." "You regret it?" Lillian turned to face him. "The opposite. That girl was brave in ways I didn't understand at the time. She knew something I didn't." "What's that?" "That sometimes the scariest thing you can do is exactly what you need to do. That running toward something hard is better than staying somewhere easy that's killing you slowly." Garrick pulled her close. "You taught me something too." "What?" "That strength isn't about never needing help. It's about showing up even when you're terrified. About keeping going when everything's falling apart. About loving people even when it might destroy you." That's a lot of lessons from one scrawny girl who couldn't carry a tray without shaking. "You never gave yourself enough credit. Even back then you were remarkable. I just didn't see it yet." "And now?" Now I see you perfectly." They stood there as the sun set, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink. The wind carried the scent of pine and wild flowers. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out and another answered. It wasn't paradise. The work would still be brutal tomorrow. The next winter would still try to kill them. The mountain would still demand everything they had. But it was home, and that made all the difference. The years that followed brought change the way years always did. Caleb grew into a man who could handle the ranch on his own when needed. He built his own cabin about a mile from the main house when he was 19, and a year later he brought home a girl from town named Sarah, quiet and capable, with her own story of running from something that didn't fit. Garrick and Lillian stood as witnesses at their wedding, and Lillian cried watching Caleb promise to be kind to this girl who'd chosen the mountains the same way Lillian had. Nora grew wild and brave, learning to track and hunt alongside Caleb, refusing to be left behind just because she was younger and smaller. At 13, she could outshoot most grown men. At 15, she started talking about seeing what lay beyond the mountains. "You're not running away," Lillian asked her one evening. "You're running towards something?" "I just want to see if there's more out there. Maybe come back with stories." Nora looked uncertain. "Would you be mad if I left?" "No, I'd be sad, but not mad. You get to choose your own path." "You chose to stay." "I did, but my path isn't yours." Nora left the following spring, 16 years old, with a bedroll and a rifle and more courage than sense. She promised to write, and she did. Letters that arrived sporadically through traders and trappers, telling stories of towns and cities, and an ocean she'd seen for the first time. Each letter ended the same way. "But I miss home. I'll come back when I'm ready." Garrick and Lillian aged together in the way of people who'd survived hard things side by side. His hair went gray, then white. His limp got worse until he needed a cane on bad days, but his hands stayed steady and his aim stayed true. Lillian's hands got rough and scarred from years of work. Her face weathered from sun and wind, but she grew into a strength she'd never imagined that girl in the saloon could possess. They took in 2 more children over the years, siblings orphaned when their parents died from sickness. Gave them the same chance Garrick had given Caleb and Nora. Watched them heal and grow and eventually choose their own paths. The cabin grew, room by room, year by year, until it was a proper house. Garrick built Lillian the bedroom with a door he'd promised. She planted gardens that actually grew. They accumulated small comforts, better furniture, more books, curtains for the windows. It was never easy. Winter still came every year with the same brutal force. Animals still died. Crops still failed. The mountain still took its toll. But they persisted. One evening, maybe 15 years after that first desperate winter, Lillian sat on the porch watching the sunset. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee, her body tired from a day of work that never seemed to end. Garrick settled beside her, moving slower these days, but still moving. "Getting old," he said. "We've been old for years." "Speak for yourself." "I'm in my prime." Lillian snorted. "Your prime needs a cane to walk to the creek." Minor detail. They sat in comfortable silence, watching colors bleed across the sky. From Caleb's cabin, they could hear laughter, him and Sarah and their 2 children. From inside the house, the orphans they were raising now were arguing about something trivial. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stood up that night?" Garrick asked. "Sometimes. I'd probably still be in that saloon, or dead, or married to someone who didn't see me. I almost didn't go to town that day. Almost decided to just give up the kids, let them go to the orphanage. Figured I couldn't do it alone." "Why didn't you?" "Because giving up felt worse than trying and failing." He looked at her. "Best decision I ever made walking into that saloon." "Second best," Lillian corrected. "What was the first?" "Saying yes when I stood up. You could have said no. Could have decided I wasn't worth the risk." "You were always worth the risk." Garrick took her hand. "You know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" "That girl nobody noticed, washing dishes in the corner while men talked over her like she wasn't there. That girl saved my life. Saved all of us." "I didn't save anyone. I just showed up. That's what saving someone looks like. Not grand gestures, just showing up, day after day, when it's hard." when it hurts, when every reason says to quit. Lillian squeezed his hand. You showed up too. We both did. We all did. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared. Inside the house, someone lit a lamp. The warm glow spilled through the windows onto the porch. You happy? Garrick asked quietly. Lillian thought about it, about the girl she'd been. Invisible, exhausted, drowning in a life that didn't fit. About the woman she'd become, scarred and weathered and stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. About the family they'd built from nothing but desperation and stubbornness and the simple choice to not give up on each other. Yeah, she said, I'm happy. Good. Me too. They sat there as darkness fell. Two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and somehow built something that lasted. Not because it was easy, not because they were perfect, but because they'd learned the truth that the mountain had been trying to teach them all along. That survival isn't about being strong enough to face everything alone. It's about being brave enough to need other people, to show up for them, to let them show up for you. That the strongest thing anyone can do is stay when staying is hard, and that sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who change everything. Years later, when Garrick's time finally came, he went peacefully in his sleep with Lillian beside him. The whole valley came to the funeral, Caleb and his grown children, Nora, who'd returned home, the families they'd helped over the years, trappers and traders who'd known Garrick as a hard man with a soft center. Lillian buried him on the hill overlooking the valley, next to a spot she'd already picked for herself. She lived another 7 years after that, running the ranch with Caleb's help, watching grandchildren grow, still taking in kids who needed a place to belong, still showing up, still staying. When her own time came, Nora was the one sitting beside her bed. You okay, Mama? Nora asked. She'd started calling Lillian that years ago, and it had stuck. I'm tired, sweetheart. You've earned a rest. Maybe. Lillian smiled weakly. Did I ever tell you why I stood up that night, in the saloon? You said nobody else would help. That was part of it. But the real reason... She paused, gathering strength. The real reason was I saw him standing there, and I saw myself. Both of us invisible to everyone else. Both of us desperate. Both of us looking for something we didn't know how to ask for. What were you looking for? A reason to matter, a place to belong, a life that meant something. Lillian's eyes drifted to the window, where she could see the valley stretching out below. And I found it, not in the way I expected, but I found it. You mattered to all of us, Nora said, crying now. You changed everything. No, sweetheart, we changed everything, all of us together. Lillian closed her eyes, and the last thing she heard was Nora's voice telling her it was okay to rest now, that they'd be okay, that she'd done enough. They buried her beside Garrick, and for years afterward, people in Blackridge Hollow and the towns beyond told stories about them, about the quiet girl who'd married a dangerous man and disappeared into the mountains, about how she'd saved a family that had every reason to fail, about how she'd proved that strength wasn't about size or power or fearlessness. It was about showing up, about staying, about choosing to fight for something even when the world said it was impossible, and that sometimes the people nobody notices are the ones who teach us what it really means to be strong. The cabin still stands, passed down through generations. Caleb's great-grandchildren live there now, working the same land, surviving the same winters, telling the same stories. They say that on quiet evenings you can still feel them there. Garrick and Lillian, Caleb and Nora, all the broken people who found each other and built something that lasted. Not because it was easy, but because they refused to quit. And in the end, that refusal to quit, that stubborn insistence on showing up day after day, on fighting for each other, on building something real out of desperation and hope. That was the only thing that ever really mattered. That was the lessons the mountain taught. That was the story worth remembering. That was the truth. The girl nobody noticed left behind for everyone who came after. Stay, fight, love. Even when it's impossible. Especially when it's impossible. Because impossible things become possible when people refuse to give up on each other. And that's a truth worth knowing.